You probably know more about Elden Ring's lore than you know about the game itself, because this From Software title is notorious for its story, its world building, and its devoted players who quite honestly obsess over the details, which unfortunately the game gives sparingly. But I understand now why people are so invested. Elden Ring is one of the most lore-dense video games I've ever played, and while I was learning all about it, I couldn't help but get completely overwhelmed by how abstract, confusing, vague, and also how brilliant the story can be. That's why in this video we're gonna cut the BS. I'm gonna explain the entire story of Elden Ring and its new DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, in as succinct of a video as possible while making it actually understandable through modern day analogy and a breakdown of the evidence we have of the facts of the world, its characters, and its rules, based mostly on item descriptions, dialogue, and trailers, which will give you the context you need to understand the full picture or die in the depths of Reddit trying. So strap on in, grab your runes, your katanas, and your flasks, and let's get right into the full story of Elden Ring. While this game has tons of vague and confusing lore that is significantly up to interpretation, we're going to focus on what we do know. Long ago, something called an outer god, specifically this one known as the Greater Will, sent his lovely daughter, the Mother of Fingers, plummeting on a shooting star down to the lands between. It also sent, probably very much later on, a star carrying something called the Elden Beast. The Mother of Fingies is essentially a Discord server owner. Or you see, she would then go on to bestow the lands with the most horrifying motherfuckers you will ever witness. A bunch of fingers in the form of two main types. Finger creepers, which are just trying to finger people, I guess, and then the two fingers, which are basically Discord moderators who are dished out to be the guides and translate the words and wisdom of Daddy Greater Will, or maybe just the Mother's Will, who was informed by Daddy Greater Will. I don't know, but the two fingers were trying to communicate to the inhabitants of the lands between. Now, on the other hand, the Elden Beast, the thing that presumably came on a later shooting star, would eventually become the Elden Ring, which isn't exactly a ring as you and I understand those circular metal things you plop on your fingies. The Elden Ring is more like an extremely powerful item that creates order, or in other words, if the lands between itself was a video game, the Elden Ring would dictate the ability to change the settings of that game, like Minecraft's difficulty setting or Ark's XP harvest and taming multipliers. You want to remove the ability for people to die permanently in the lands between? Uncheck this funny little destined death box, and suddenly you've just disabled dying, allowing people to respawn. Hopefully that illustrates what the Elden Ring actually is, because it took me a good while to understand it. It's not really a ring, it's a rule set. So this Elden Ring is here now. What happened to it? Who used it? Well, first what we know is that a race of dragons used the Elden Ring. For an entity to command the ring and to a degree become one with it, they had to become a god. Not in the sense that an outer god is a god, just a regular god by this definition. Then they needed what we call an Elden Lord. It's almost like Star Wars with the Sith and their rule of two. Needless to say, the first Elden Lord that we're aware of was a dragon called Placidusax. His god was a dragon god that we don't really know anything about, just that it had to exist and that he essentially served it. The god is the one who serves or embodies the Elden Ring, and the Elden Lord is the one who serves said god, protects them, and ensures the order or configuration of the ring remains as the god intends for it to be. The Greater Will, on the other hand, just seemed to want some kind of order for the ring. They don't necessarily care about which order it is, just that there is an order at all. It's almost like the Greater Will is a server provider company, and the eventual gods that create orders are server owners. All the peasant players just kind of have to deal with the configuration the owner sets, and said owners could be open or closed-minded to suggestions in changing that order. Just hope to God that your outer god isn't Nitrato, or you're f***ed either way. Beyond simplifying these abstract concepts to analogies of the modern video game industry, what happened next with these ancient dragons? Accompanying the dragons were also a race of beastmen, which were given exceedingly high intelligence, wisdom that actually was beyond humanity's later intelligence. How they got this insanely high intelligence, nobody knows, but they used it to create tools and weapons and build the monolithic structure of Fara Missoula, what seemed to be both a burial site and an actual city for the dragons and the beastmen. These beastmen appeared to go through multiple phases of technological advancement, like the Stone Age, and eventually having access to metals like iron. Now, while the beastmen are just kind of vibing, the dragons, as it would turn out, were kind of having some drama. Placidusax was fighting with another dragon, or some kind of wyvern, and a really nasty one at that. Its name was Baal the Dread. The two had an insane fight and had mutually serious injuries dished to each other. At some point later on, the ancient and first Elden Lord, Placidusax, was abandoned by his god, and so he was just like, alright, I guess I'll just get locked behind time and just wait for my god to return. So that he did. Whether he did it himself or some other force locked him away in time, I don't know. A meteorite eventually struck the city of Fara Missoula, and this may have been a reason why it suddenly began to float into the sky, where it was engulfed in a seemingly never-ending storm, which, in combination with the meteor's damage, crumbled the city apart. Placidusax didn't care about any of this, obviously, because he was just chilling in his time vacuum, though definitely pretty mortally wounded. Around this era, there appeared to be a dynasty civilization which we know little about. They may have been the first actual humans in the lands between, along with other kinds of entities like the Onyx and Alabaster Lords, which were like stone people. This marked the end of the ancient dragon's reign, since with Fara Missoula floating and being torn apart, their god gone, and their Elden Lord just chilling beyond time, what were they supposed to do in order to continue the purpose of the Elden Ring? The dragons decided to migrate to the snowy part of the lands between. Said dragons' descendants would eventually become the kind of modern-day dragons, and early on in the timeline, they fought a war against the giants. See, the modern-day dragons were residing in the snow until a race of fire giants came and said, no, we're gonna live here now instead. Goodbye. So the dragons were chased off and the giants settled in, where they would come to create smithing, or a giant version of smithing. They created a giant forge, or cauldron, or whatever you want to call this thing, which housed a powerful flame called the Flame of Ruin, a very strong flame, mind you. Around this time also, there were human astrologers that had an early society and were effectively just hanging out in the snowy mountains with the giants, seemingly without conflict. On the other hand, the Zamor civilization also developed in the snow, and they hated the fire giants for some reason. Over time, the astrological civilization migrated down from the mountains to what would eventually become the Liurnian region. You might be wondering, by the way, who exactly is the Elden Lord right now, or the god for that matter, of the lands between? We don't have concrete evidence for that. All we know is that these civilizations of largely different humans developed and migrated around the landmass. They may have been in undocumented eras of Elden Ring configurations. But before we get into the Elden Ring configurations, it is pivotal that we talk about the Crucible. This is a term thrown around throughout the game with a disgusting amount of vagueness suffocating it. What we get hinted at throughout the game, especially in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, is that the Crucible is some kind of near incomprehensible essence by which life, divine or not, is able to be created from. Like a creative mode menu in Minecraft, but probably without the actual user interface because, well, this is an abstract fantasy concept. Whatever the Crucible looks or acts like, it seemed to be viewed by different cultures in different ways. For example, one particular culture known as the Hornsent people viewed it as a kind of spiral, and their architecture and accompanying items of worship towards the Crucible are seen as such, spiraling upwards towards the heavens. The Crucible also gave them horns, which they viewed as blessed and confirmed their belief that they were a chosen people. The Hornsent viewing themselves as a chosen people had some dire consequences for those around them, specifically those who weren't Hornsent.
I don't like where this is going.
Namely, the shaman people. See, the Hornsent were really into ritualistic sacrificial practices to appease what they thought was the Crucible, and so they actually started to massacre the shaman people since their flesh had a special property to meld harmoniously with others, and was thus good for being turned into a funny substance. They would torture these people, the shaman, and combine them together into big meatballs, and then stuff them into pots to become these saints, as they were deemed lower than the Hornsent, and I guess they just wanted any people around them to become higher beings by being inside of pots? So basically the Hornsent were like Nazi Germany, and I think you can figure out the rest of the analogy. By the way, all of this was taking place in what we can easily assume to have been part of the lands between at this point. Yes, this information has been confirmed in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, which takes place in the Realm of Shadow, but this Realm of Shadow definitely was not always enshrouded in shadow, so it must have been in some way connected to our main landmass, the Lands Between, with some theorizing that it literally occupied the same exact space, being right here in the middle of the other sort of like parts of the land. With that clarified, let's continue. So the Hornsent kept making meatballs out of the shaman people, and they were also working on this Divine Gateway project to create a god. They seem to be using the shaman people to make the jars, and as well as to make the portal or gateway itself. There's also these bodies that are attached to the sort of like spiraling castle structure, which is what the Divine Gateway rests on top of. We actually see this thing in game as basically being constructed with loads of bodies attached, like effigies. This portal was presumably going to be used to make their Empyrean, their chosen candidate for godhood, a god. Her name was Grandam. Eventually, throughout all of the atrocities these Hornsent people were committing, at some point one of the peasant shaman people named Marika had enough. We don't know when, but Marika one day managed to make contact with the Mother of Fingers, Matir. It is theorized that Marika was able to contact Matir because of one of these hollowed ruins that can be found right next to the actual shaman village that Marika came from. Multiple NPCs say that the one who rings the bell has their fate guided by the stars, or that they'll be cradled by the Exalted Mother. So presumably Marika rang the bell, met the Exalted Mother, Matir, and was then chosen as an Empyrean herself. Again, a candidate, but seemingly by this separate divine entity. On the other hand, whether the Fingers chose the other Empyrean, Grandam, or the Crucible and the Hornsent did, it's not really clear. Matir having chosen Marika was separate to anything to do with the Crucible and the Hornsent, but acted as a parallel to what they were doing. Marika then being chosen was set on her path to godhood, and here's where things get pretty fuzzy. Marika took note of everything here, right? The sacrifices, the Crucible, the whole let's create a god with this divine gateway shit. And I guess she was like, you know what? Why don't I become the god and create a version of the Crucible that is different from this one and doesn't involve sacrificing my people? So basically she did that. Somehow. We see that in the story trailer for the Shadow of the Erdtree, Marika is walking up steps of corpses and makes it to this divine gateway we've been talking about after she pulls out some golden strands out of this fleshy hole of a corpse or something, and then from there, gold arose. She got to this point by seducing and betraying her way to the top. I have no idea how. I don't think anyone really knows how, but let's go with it. Also, it's important to clarify that as an Empyrean, Marika may have been given her shadow around this time, which was basically a companion to aid her in her potential ascendancy. In her case, it was this wolf guy named Malekith, which will come in later on. Anyway, after this gold arose and Marika did her weird ritual thing with the gateway, this seemed to create a fundamental landmass changing consequence for the Lands Between. We can assume there was at this point beginnings of something called the Erdtree, and something we refer to as the shadow of the Erdtree called the Scadutree. Was the Scadutree created alongside the Erdtree? Could the Scadutree just be the Crucible? So many questions, so few answers. So the Erdtree begins and gold has risen. Oh yeah, and Marika's now a god. Focusing on the Lands Between, let's talk about a pivotal moment around when she became a god, which was that a city named Landale was founded and built around the now existing, albeit perhaps young, Erdtree. With Marika acting as the ruler or god and, representing order, this was now the age of the Erdtree conquest in the Lands Between. People weren't just going to accept the Erdtree without good reason, so Marika was about to make them understand. She needed some serious strength and an Elden Lord specifically, so she married a barbarian named Horalu. This guy was an absolute tank, known for his strength and might makes right mentality. In order for him to chill out and not be as tyrannical as he had historically been, he decided to take who was once hailed as the Lord of Beasts, Sarash, onto his back, or in other words, a kind of sentient bottleneck for his rage, in the form of this weird spirit lion thing that essentially suppressed his lust for killing. Though Horalu was still dangerous because he's an insane barbarian. Nonetheless, when he made this change, I guess with it he changed his name, which became Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, which, as you should remember, doesn't actually make him the first Elden Lord, need we forget, plus itchy sacks. Godfrey was determined to scour over the land, ensuring that all knew how important and powerful the Erdtree was. We know that in his conquest he found the Storm Lord, which was known as the Stormhawk King, and was super powerful for its epic wind attack, which we really only hear about. A shame, really, because I would have loved to see that thing during its prime, instead of being forced to settle with its presumed descendants, these horrible monstrosities that have knives attached to their feet and try to throw fucking barrels at you like they're playing Donkey Kong.
You fucking
fucking kidding me? After Godfrey claimed the land that the Stormhawk was seemingly guarding, this was where he had the castle of Stormvale built, which has a big ol' statue of Godfrey in it to honor the Lord. There was also Castle Morn down south, which Godfrey took over himself and I guess massacred a bunch of people in the process. There's a sword of all the swords of the fallen people that you can actually find there, which seemingly was forged because someone was very, very angry at Godfrey and wanted to avenge their fallen comrades. One of the other threats, though, to America's order, and a big one at that, was the army of fire giants. They were still around, and they didn't really appreciate the whole Erdtree just sprouting out of nowhere and those who worshipped and conquested for it to be prancing around the place acting like they were now the rightful owners of the entire lands between. The fire giants themselves had that insanely powerful flame crucible thing as well, a perfectly useful weapon for burning a giant golden tree, so America and her armies were definitely a bit paranoid. Godfrey led a huge war against them, and naturally, the fire giants fought back. In this war, Queen America was able to bring many allies to her side, including the trolls, descendants of the giants, which were just like, yeah, we like the Erdtree, so we're gonna fight for it now, as well as the Knights of Zamor, those people I briefly mentioned earlier that really hated the fire giants, and the fire monks, which were a coalition of people that used an incantation to protect Godfrey's army from the flame of the giants. There was apparently some kind of god called the Fell God, which existed inside the giants after Queen America herself fought said Fell God, but we don't really know much about its significance beyond that. After the armies of the Erdtree wiped out the fire giants with all kinds of methods, including impaling them with thorny stakes that went through their bodies, like, bro, what the hell? Only one fire giant remained, and he was just like, F you guys. And since America couldn't actually stop the insanely powerful flame that existed inside the crucible slash forge slash fire cup pod device thing, she cursed the dude with the eternal babysitting of it. The giants were dealt with, and that made America mildly satisfied, but not fully, I guess, judging by what happens later. During this new established era, as people began to accept the Erdtree and the lands between, it at least gave them something in return, in the form of holy sap that seemed to drip off and was collected by the people, having mystical, perhaps healing properties. As part of the Erdtree effectively began to establish real control over the lands, due to, of course, the actions of those who acted on it, like the Queen America and her Elden Lord Godfrey, this control would be ever strengthened by the children of the pair. Godfrey and America seemed to have about 3 kin around the same time. These consisted of Moog and Morgott, who were known as Omen twins, which meant that they were kind of cursed with these horrible horns all over them and were banished to live in the sewers. This was going to have dire consequences, but I guess they just hated omens because they were reminiscent of the Crucible era. Regardless, America and Godfrey had another child named Godwin at some point as well, which was kind of their star angel child. Godwin the Golden was his title, and he helped to further establish control by this now golden lineage that he was a part of. See, as a result of being their kin, America's children were demigods, or in other words, half-gods, including Moog, Morgott, and of course Godwin. To tell you a little bit more about them, Moog was really pissed off about being banished to the sewers, so he turned to blood magic via the Formless Mother. Morgott was like, I know they hate me, but I still love them. And Godwin, well, he was just the special one and got special treatment. He seemed nice enough though. Were there more children from America and Godfrey? Who knows, but for now, those are the 3 to be aware of. Alright, now if that was a lot to take in, I get it. Let's all take a deep breath so we can process all of the insane wizardry that just occurred. Let us now continue where we left off in the last chapter with the continuation of the Golden Lineage and where things really start to pick up. Remember way back near the beginning when I was talking about the astrologers that came down from the snowy mountains to a western region that would later become Liurnia? Well, those people had progressed quite a lot since I last talked about them. There was the Carian royal family, and then there was the Academy of Raya Lucaria. They were separate initially, but one of the Carian royals, a woman named Rennala, brought the 2 factions together. She just had, like, ultimate riz. Rennala was seemingly a princess, along with her younger sister R'Lana. Each of them had some kind of magical moon, meaning that they were moon twins. R'Lana would later take both of these for herself, but that's DLC territory. At some point, once the then established sort of golden order, golden lineage was in full force, the armies of Queen America tried to liberate or take control of Liurnia. But the prideful Liurnians would not have it. There was a huge war that commenced, and one of the big players in said war was a man that seemingly came out of nowhere, Radagon. This dude is really important. Perhaps coming into existence at the birth of the Golden Order configuration itself, he has a very strange connection to Queen America. Radagon himself is Queen Marika embodied as another person, in this case a man. How might this work? Did they do mitosis? No clue. Regardless, this Radagon of the Golden Order fought against Rennala in battle during the Liurnia Wars, and by the end of the Second War, yes, there was a second one, Radagon was just like, okay, I'm gonna make the war stop by drinking this so-called celestial dew at the Church of Vows and profess my love for Rennala, thus ending the wars and uniting both sides. And then he actually did it. Cool? So then both the people of Liurnia and the Golden Order were peacefully united and everyone lived happily ever after. Oh wait, this is a FromSoft game. So Radagon and Rennala smashed. They had 3 kids, Radahn, Ranni, and Rykard. Radahn became a general of the Red Mane forces in Caelid to the southeast. Ranni took after her mother and studied sorceries, and Rykard went on to become a justiciar who led inquisitors that tortured those considered heretics to the Golden Order. Speaking of the Golden Order, remember the Elden Lord Godfrey? Well, he was starting to lose his grace around this time, which Marika seemed to create when gold arose in that cursed portal of bodies. Grace was extended by Marika to everyone except the Hornsent, and eventually was temporarily taken from the Tarnished, which Godfrey was becoming. After fighting Marika's wars and pretty much cleansing the land of all major conflict, the hue from Godfrey's eyes started to fade. As his usefulness came to an end, Queen Marika had a plan. After questioning the Greater Will and the meaning of everything, she seemingly wanted to test it. She may have believed that bonds were to be broken and hardships had to be endured to fully understand the truth of the Greater Will. To test said beliefs, she divorced Godfrey and sent him away, along with his tarnished descendants. Marika's plan is repeated by this woman named Melina as follows.
In Marika's own words, my lord and thy warriors, I divest each of thee of thy grace. With thine eyes dimmed, ye will be driven from the lands between. Ye will wage war in a land afar, where ye will live and die.
So with Godfrey banished, along with apparently all of his tarnished warriors, descendants, or whatever homies he left with, and as a lot of the major conflict was totally put to rest, things were chill, until the lands between was shocked with a huge scandal. Radagon left Rennala. Why exactly? Well, remember Radagon and Marika were possibly the same being at this point somehow, just split into a guy and a girl. So Marika wanted to merge back into Radagon, which would explain why he suddenly left Rennala. If you recall, he kind of came out of nowhere in the first place back when he led the people into battle while fighting against the Carians, initially, inevitably later uniting the two houses. Regardless, after leaving Rennala, Radagon married Queen Marika and had kids. Is this asexual? I don't know. And if there weren't already too many demigod names starting with M, oh boy!
I thought Melania, is that the fucking girl I'm talking to at the campfire?
No.
Who is she?
That's Melina.
Dude, Melina, Melania, Marika, how the fuck is anyone supposed to fucking remember this shit?
I pray to the outer gods so you don't have half as hard of a time as I did trying to desperately remember the names of these characters early on in my journey as a wee little tarnished. Marika and Radagon's new kids, a set of twins, were kind of weird. Miquella was cursed with eternal squeaker syndrome. He looked like a kid for life and wanted to help his sister. Said sister, Melania, was cursed with scarlet rot inside of her and cared very much about protecting Miquella. That said, apparently in Elden Ring you should not have twins, especially not with yourself. Marika also had a son named Mesmer as well, and also seemingly had another child named Melina. There's no direct named evidence for this whole Melina theory, but with the Erdtree DLC and Mesmer's item description saying he had a little sister, it is now more heavily implied than ever. Melina, most likely, went on to become the Glowmite Queen, which I'll talk about a little later on. Back to Mesmer, though. Like Melania and Miquella, he was also cursed. Mesmer had a writhing snake inside of him, and Marika decided, I'm gonna pluck out your eye and put in place a golden eye, which will seal your stupid snakes inside you and make you chill. But apparently this wasn't enough to stop the snakes from coming out or something, so out of fear of this cursed snake shit, she sent him to the land or realm of shadow where he was to tie up some loose ends. Remember the horrible Hornsent people that massacred Marika's people long before she became a god? Well, they were still alive, and she really thought that they shouldn't be alive anymore because of what they had done in the past, and were maybe even still doing to a degree. So to kill two birds with one stone, she sent Mesmer to the region she had arisen from with an army, and utilizing these huge fire golems that wielded a very very powerful flame, one which was powerful enough to burn body and soul, Messmer basically burned the ever-living shit out of the Hornsent people and torched their main capital city, Belurat. In this process, though, Marika seemed to seal off the region, making it permanently in the shadow of the Erdtree, and now a very difficult place to travel to, because it's as if the landmass was a part of the lands between 1 second and then the next it was just poofed, becoming the realm of shadow. I guess going with Messmer on the crusade was a few people, including Renala's sister, R'hllana, who very much wanted to help Messmer massacre the Hornsent and was considered his blade or protector, but also coming with him was a guy named Gaius, a friend of Radahn, who was the leader of Messmer's men, his commander. And real quick, speaking of the men that made up this army, many of them were on board with the massacre genuinely, but then a lot of them may have been sent there against their own will, with some suggested to have been prisoners. This would totally make sense, since not only would the whole crusade be killing 2 birds with 1 stone, it would be killing 3, because Marika would be first killing the Hornsent, second getting rid of her very dangerous child Messmer, and third banishing a load of prisoners or unwanted people in the lands between. So after Marika did this, things may have been pretty chill, but the reality of the Golden Lineage meant that one day she would be replaced, probably. One potential candidate to replace her was Nikolai, who was an Empyrean. He made a vow to his half-brother, Radahn, saying this:
Lord brother, I'm going to be a god. If we honor our part of the vow, promise me you'll be my consort. I'll make the world a gentler place.
Radahn probably seemed pretty cool to Nikolai, and in appearance he was probably just as young as Nikolai at this point, making them very obvious peers. And again, half-brothers. Radahn was generally a nice demigod, and I could see why Nikolai would respect him heavily, but to go as far as wanting him to be Nikolai's Elden Lord / King Consort whenever Nikolai eventually would become a god after becoming an Empyrean, that's something. What exactly are the terms of this vow? Unexplained. Was Nikolai really into guys? Unexplained. Will there be an uptick of Rule 34 results after people fully catch wind of this? Unexplained. One thing we can almost definitively say for sure is that Nikolai loved his sister a lot and was very invested in trying to find a cure for her kind of major problem. Malenia also loved Nikolai very much and devoted herself to being his blade or protector, with the two of them compensating for each other's flaws. They were both candidates for godhood, Empyreans, as so many of the offspring of Marika seemed to be, including, once Marika later married Radagon, Ranni. Remember the character I talked about like over 5 minutes ago that I barely elaborated on? Well, Ranni, the sister of Radahn and Rykard, became an Empyrean once her father Radagon married Marika. So both she and Nikolai and Malenia, now Ranni's half-siblings, were all given 2 fingers to help guide them in their potential ascendancy to godhood. The 3 were also presumably given shadows, and we know that Ranni's shadow was a wolfman dude thing named Blythe. Taking a step back from the Golden family though for a minute, we ought to mention the Godskins, because they're pretty important both as a player, holy shit this fight sucks, and in the grand scheme of the lore. To put it simply, remember Messmer's sister Melina? Well, she is very likely, due to a shit ton of evidence, the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Said queen was known to be an Empyrean chosen by the Fingers, which would definitely further add to the evidence of her being Melina. But also, for whatever reason, Marika seemed to cast Melina out. I guess she was cursed too. So if she was kicked out of the royal family and she also was the Gloam-Eyed Queen, then she was later responsible for some pretty crazy stuff. See, the queen made these things called Godskin Apostles, followers that were made from weird artificial means, and they wanted nothing more than to slay gods, wielding the power of destined death. They primarily used a black flame incantation in combat, which, due to the destined death imbued in it, was able to slay gods. Who they slayed? I'm not sure. We may or may not have the actual names of these gods that they apparently slayed and may or may not have made clothes out of, but they're pretty menacing nonetheless. I mean, just look at this midsummer looking ass village later on, like what the is this? With the Godskins being a threat to the Golden Lineage, Marika sent her shadow Malekith to destroy them. Malekith fought and killed the Gloam-Eyed Queen, or if Melina is in fact the same person, burned her but didn't kill her entirely, because somehow in the way future when you're actually playing the game, Melina is a spirit ghost lady thing that follows you around and talks to you. Anyway, to further prevent anyone from wielding Destined Death to kill any more gods, Marika sealed away the Destined Death rune itself, which was previously part of the Elden Ring configuration, with Malekith to guard it, sealing the rune in his sword. With the Destined Death rune then removed from the ring, this essentially created an entirely new configuration or order of its own, which may have been Marika and the Fingers' goal all along, what we refer to as the Golden Order. Was this Golden Order gonna last long? Maybe, or maybe if you're Ronnie, you really don't want to become a god and despise the fact that you're an Empyrean and decide, hey, I'm gonna kill my half-brother and do this insane satanic ritual to ensure that I don't have to remain beholden to this stupid god crap. So remember Godwyn, Marika and Godfrey's son? Well, he was just doing shit, being a pretty cool guy, before these Black Knife assassins who were hired by Ronnie to go and steal a shard of Malekith's sword came and shanked Godwyn with this destined death-infused shard, carving a piece of this death symbol circle into him, while Ronnie, on the other hand, also had that symbol carved into her, which caused an insane magic reaction that can only be described as needlessly complicated. Godwyn seemed to lose his soul, while his body was still a vessel for a soul, which is apparently really bad when combined with the whole destined death thing. And then Ronnie, on the other hand, kept her soul but lost the tether to her human flesh, at which point she put her soul into a doll's body. Godwyn's body, on the other hand, was discovered and mourned by the Golden family, being buried at the roots of an ancient great tree underground. Unfortunately, while Ronnie's body is just hanging out on top of a tower still, Godwyn's body became an eldritch horror because of the circumstances of his death and spread an entirely new thing called Deathroot all around the lands between. Following the tragic death and spreading of her son, Marika was distraught. Also, the people of the lands between were like, yo, demigods can die? And a lot of chaos broke out. There was a decent amount of fighting. Demigods like Mikola outright abandoned the Golden Order fundamentalism, which was basically him going, I never cared about this shit anyways, I prefer more overt incest. And everything else was just getting to a breaking point before Marika decided, hey, I'm gonna literally shatter the Elden Ring. Which she then proceeded to do.
Okay.
To recap this insane and very long chapter, Marika shrouded what seemed to be part of the previous Lands Between in shadow, the shadow of the Erdtree. Some people stayed in the Land of Shadow, some people stayed in what we know as the proper Lands Between. The demigods mostly all just seemed to be trying to chill out and get by, while Mikola was doing some really weird shit, making vows to do some incest stuff with Radahn, which may or may not have been consensual, while Mesmer was sent off to massacre the Hornsent people, which probably had it coming considering what they did to Marika's people back in the day. Then Godwyn was assassinated, Ronnie became a doll, and Marika shattered the Elden Ring, marking the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The Shattering. With the Elden Ring shattered, some of the demigods got their hands on different pieces of it, and ultimately none could agree on who should be the Elden Lord and succeed whatever soulless creature Marika/Radagon was at this point. The demigods fought harder than the 11-year-olds competing to type first on every YouTube video. To start, Rykard, if you recall, Rennala and Radagon's son, was suddenly very against the Golden Order, or whatever was left of it, fighting wars to become the new Elden Lord by force. He would eventually retreat to his volcano manor and get eaten by a giant snake that whispered sweet nothings to him. His brother Radahn, on the other hand, still appreciated the Golden Order and resided in Caelid, which was experiencing its own issues with scarlet rot outbreaks. His sister Ranni, now a literal doll, was just chilling in a tower with an ultimate plan to follow through on her fate, which was apparently to remove all control from the gods and allow the stars to determine things, and with her connection to the Astrological Society being Rennala's daughter, that kind of makes sense. But what about the other demigods? Well, early in the Shattering War, one of Godfrey's old descendants, Godfroy the Grafted, actually tried his hand at attacking Landale, because he wanted to be Elden Lord, I guess, but he failed miserably and was imprisoned. And then his son, Godric the Grafted, ran like a coward, eventually making it over to Stormvale Castle, which he kind of took over. But while Godric is a meaningless character that nobody likes, Mikola and Malenia, during this period of the Shattering era, were doing some stuff to prepare for when the vow Mikola made way back when would eventually bear fruit. See, Mikola saw what happened to Godwyn, with his body having just been spread through the Lands Between and being capable of manifesting as more than just a body. Mikola also seemed to know at this point a funny, quirky little fact about the Realm of Shadow, which was that to actually enter now, like to go to the place yourself, you had to absolve yourself of your flesh, somehow basically doing what Ranni and Godwyn seemed to do in their own ways. So Mikola came up with an idea, or a way to get to the Realm of Shadow, because of how important it was to his overall plan, to become a god and to have Radahn be his consort. He first created something called the Haligtree by taking an Erdtree sapling, watering it with his own blood, and growing it into a gigantic, sprawling Eden of empathy, or so you'd think. This Haligtree was actually a place for people to sort of chill out and escape from being hunted or chased down by the Golden Order, for example. This was a pretty popular place for the Albanurics, which were like these sort of artificial GMO creatures, kind of like the Godskin apostles we talked about earlier. Mikola's sister, Malenia, also hung out here at the Haligtree, where Mikola worked on methods to try and cure her scarlet rot with things like unalloyed gold, which helped to treat the disease to a degree. Mikola eventually had enough dilly-dallying around trying to save Melania and decided, hey, it's time we do that thing I made the vow for like a long time ago, and Melania was just like, sure. Mikola cocooned himself in the Haligtree, which rid himself of his body, maybe sort of, while making it have some usefulness to the tree and the people there, but while also detaching his soul to be able to get to the Shadow Realm. And around this time, he also sent Melania to attack and fight Radahn, I guess to the death over in Caelid. Scarlet Rot was pretty bad over there, and Melania was like, hey, so I'm gonna get you. And Radahn was like, nuh-uh, you're f***ing disabled. And Melania was like, I'm gonna stab us both now. Then she was like, Mikola awaits thee, O promised consort. Before turning into a giant flower blossom and corrupting the shit out of Radahn, destroying his cognition and stripping him of all but his body, his anorexic horse, and a now very tormented mind. Melania went into like a coma and was carried back to the Haligtree by one of her soldiers, and that was that. There are so many questions, like, did Radahn actually agree to be Mikola's consort? Which, if you don't know the definition, that means spouse, basically. So, did this dude actually consent to being in an incest relationship with his half-brother that also looked eternally like a young child, or was he manipulated? We know that Mikola can absolutely manipulate people to do his bidding by what happened next, which was that after Radahn got completely obliterated and basically turned into a Scarlet Rot zombie, Mikola was like, alright, I need a temporary sugar daddy to do some other stuff so that Radahn can ultimately be my real sugar daddy. Which takes us to Mohg. Oh, poor Mohg. You might not actually be the Mohg Lester that we thought you were.
They just kept calling me the Mohg Lester. But finally people know the truth about the Mika Lester.
Remember this guy? This was one of Godfrey's sons that he had with Marika, one of the banished Omen twins that worshipped blood magic, and he happened to be perfect for manipulation because unlike his twin brother Morgoth, who defended the Golden Order with every fiber in his being, Mohg was pretty vengeful seeming. At least he thought he had better ideas than what the Golden Order was all about. Regardless, Mikola seemingly manipulated Mohg into taking Mikola's cocoon out of the Haligtree, placing it into Mohg's own underground temple known as Mohgwyn Palace, and guarding it. Why did Mikola want Mohg to do this? Apparently, so that one day someone might come along and kill Mohg, allowing Mikola to use Mohg's demigod body, yoink it into the realm of shadows somehow, and pair it with Radahn's soul, reviving him with a new body in the Shadow Realm. Yeah, it's like simple, right? If you're also so incredibly confused by this story that you've completely lost any hope that the writers were not snorting copious amounts of cocaine while coming up with this shit, I am right there with you. Mikola's plan to eventually revive Radahn in the Shadow Realm, make him his Elden Lord, and become Radahn's god in the process seemed to pretty much solely hinge on some random bozo coming up and slaughtering zombie Radahn and Mohg. This plan also very much kind of aligned with Marika's, or was similar to hers when she went through the process of shattering the Elden Ring. See, she wanted to allow the Tarnished to return to the Lands Between by extending grace to them, which, if you recall, she took away a long time ago. Were the Tarnished a backup? It kind of seems like they were, in case the whole not-so-golden order were to fall apart. So, it's time to meet you. You, the player. Yes, you. You're Tarnished. Welcome back from being banished away and having your poor grace taken away from you. There are many like you who have returned to the Lands Between to seek the Elden Ring and become the new Elden Lord. Many who tried, all so far who have failed. But you'll be different, because this is a video game and no matter how many times you die, you will always try again. Sweatier than before, but don't let that get you down. Your character wakes up after being extended this grace and making some kind of travel to the Lands Between through a metaphorical or real fog. Just to be clear, there are other continents on the planet the Lands Between takes place on. And for example, if you choose the Samurai loadout when creating your Tarnish, you'll find that they come from the distant Land of Reeds. Whoever your character is though, they'll eventually stumble their way outside of a church-like building and take their first steps into the Lands Between. Guided by your grace, you learn the layout of this place, meeting its inhabitants, a now shattered, lost, and broken people. You fight monsters, all kinds of creatures of strange origin, yet many of them give clues to the lost, rich, ancient history left behind. Eventually you fight bosses and start to make your presence known in this land, all the while being guided by Melina, the strange, confused spirit that seems to be left behind from the Glow-Eyed Queen. After slaying dragons, shardbearers, and even demigods, at some point you have a choice to make. Go straight to where Marika and Radagon are conjoined, locked away in the Erdtree, or pursue and hunt down Radahn, the brain-rotted demigod, and eventually Mohg, who at the time you understand to be a kidnapper. Your choice of pursuing the main quest or Miklah's is split depending on whether you want to engage with the DLC. This video of course covers said DLC, so let's talk about what happens when you do what Mykla was really banking on after all those years before you showed up. After fighting and slaying Radahn, and seemingly after a certain happy little pot man named Alexander eats Radahn's entire corpse, the demigod is then set free from his flesh and seemingly capable of existing in the realm of shadow. All I know is that you have to kill Radahn. Afterwards, you find Mohg, fight him in his palace, and ultimately slay him. This is the point where one of Miklah's followers, Leda, tells you to go and touch Miklah's hand, to be transported to the realm of shadow. Mykla yoinks Mohg's corpse to go there himself, and this is where the DLC begins. So now you're here, in the realm of shadow, in the shadow of the Erdtree. If you're anything like me, you're really confused about what this place is, where it is, how any of this works. But nonetheless, let's carry on. Before you got here, Mykla actually got here first, even though you're responsible for letting him come here, I guess? So he must have done some stuff like really fast, just straight up like any percent speedrun the DLC. He abandoned his flesh of his old or his new body in the Shadow Realm, but not just his flesh. See, he abandoned parts of his mind, it seemed, including another individual entirely that was actually a part of Mykla. See, much like how Marika had another person inside her, that being Radagon, which she could split off and reform into seemingly at will, Mykla also had another component, that being a girl named Saint Trina. We don't know much about Saint Trina other than the fact that she was a girl and that she eventually blossomed into a flower creature entity once Mykla, in the process of leaving everything of himself behind, split her off of himself, leaving her to just hang out at the bottom of this gigantic hole in the Shadow Realm. So after he left Saint Trina, as well as his eyes, his arms, and basically every part of himself behind, once arriving in the Shadow Realm, he kind of just goes up to the Divine Gateway in this shadowy tower that Marika had initially locked behind long ago after becoming a god herself, and he just kind of waited. Or maybe that's when he started to use Mohg's body to birth the new Radahn by pairing his soul with the body. Now, okay, with all that set up, we can finally get to you, Tarnished. You explore this new place and find that Mykla has a lot of followers. A lot of these followers were charmed up until a certain point in the DLC before the charm was broken, including an NPC named Ansbach, who actually used to be a follower of Mohg and claimed that he tried to free Mohg from Mykla's charm only to be charmed himself. A good representation of this charm is how Mykla is capable of actually stealing your heart during the final boss fight, in which he grabs you and he promises a 1,000-year voyage guided by compassion. Then if he grabs you twice, instead of the game saying you died, it says heart stolen, and you pretty much die like normal, but you just like hang out. But we're gonna get into the boss fight later. So nonetheless, this realm of shadows is where you're introduced to a ton of new bosses, and you discover exactly what Mesmer did to this place before it was enshrouded in shadow with all this genocide and everything. Except wait, Mesmer is still being a fire terrorist. Seems like he's really clinging on to his trauma from when Marika locked him in the Shadow Realm, because he seemingly still depends on the idea of her, albeit horrible, motherhood for emotional support, like in one of his cutscenes.
No, mother, forgive me.
You kill bosses, roll through this land like you're the main character, because you kind of are, and discover a bunch of lore. Lore which I've just spent definitely too many hours examining. Once you absolutely obliterate the local population, burn this shadow seal crap with the kindling you stole from Mesmer's corpse, and make your way through this castle found above the tortured city of Bellerat, you finally come face to face with the final boss of the DLC, young Radahn, which is using Mohg's body. He doesn't speak, he just tries to mercilessly kill you as fast as humanly possible. Oh. You probably steamroll the shit out of Radahn in phase 1, which isn't too bad, but then, in his second phase, Mykla finally comes out, wrapping himself around Radahn, and again, if he grabs you, he will make you fail the fight by stealing your heart. Bro really said, "I'm gay, and you?" I'm gay too, I think. Once you finally kill what may arguably be the most difficult boss fight in the game, you Elden Ring superfans can be the judge of that, we get a memory from Mykla revealing the vow he made way back when. And then, it's over. You just killed Mykla and let Radahn finally have a fucking rest after everything he was just put through. And that's sort of it. If you decide to do the DLC and see everything through to the end, you're gonna kill Mykla, which, by the way, is exactly what his banished other half, Saint Trina, suggested that you do, given that, like Marika seemed to find godhood to be a prison, detaching her mentally from her own values and humanity. The same was very likely to happen to Mykla if he actually, fully went through with this. But with the DLC covered, where do we go next? Well, the endings to the base game itself, of course, which we're gonna go over now. After you either skip the entire DLC or complete it and continue onward with the rest of the main game, what exactly do you do? Well, the issue you get to is that the Erdtree, which houses America in it, is sealed off by some crazy Erdtree thorns and stuff, so you need to burn it in order to get through the blockage. Thus, if you didn't already slay the fire giant that sits atop the snowy mountain guarding the big ol' forge thing, then that's probably your next stop. Yes, this is the same dude that was eternally cursed by America to stay up here attending the flame. He is not a happy boy, not at all, and I definitely wasn't either while fighting him. Stupid f***ing
Come on, one more.
Burke! Suck my nuts in your mouth! Swallow! Swallow, nihil! Swallow!
After killing the fire giant, Melina pops up and she's like, okay, so now I'm gonna light the whole ass tree on fire and die, I guess. So she does, and without warning, she also teleports you to that ancient dragon city, Farum Azula, which I talked about like 30 minutes ago, and just dies in the process. She's gone. She's dead. The fire killed her. Melina is gone. Now, if you recall, this place that you just got teleported to, Farum Azula, got totally wrecked by a meteor and started floating and getting engulfed in a seemingly never-ending storm. Why did Melina teleport you here? Well, this was to assure that you were in the right place to carry on this sort of part of the deal where you're going to become Elden Lord. That's why she had just herself, was to kind of help you, and the reason you needed to come to Farum Azula to do that was because destined death was still sealed here, and what that meant is that gods couldn't be killed. Rewinding a bit back to when Godwyn was killed, Malekith, the furry guy which was responsible for not allowing anyone to get their hands on even a shard of his sword, which had destined death sealed in it, he kind of failed at his job. So he was like, I'm really angry and I'm gonna seal this sword literally inside of me, which he did way back when. So you explore Farum Azula and eventually find Malekith, who, after pretending to be a really unnaturally acrobatic sausage man in some oddly concealed robes, tears them all off when his health bar reaches halfway, and then proceeds to probably f***ing obliterate you.
Thank you, Ned.
Dude, I
Suck at this bar!
Whenever you manage to kill him, though, the rune of destined death is then, I guess, just unsealed, and the gods can now be killed. Yippee! You head back to the Erdtree, and after doing everything your tarnished mind may desire, you head inside for the final showdown. So you gotta fight Radagon, which is also America. You can see the Elden Ring, like, literally embedded inside of them. It's pretty cool. Once you slay Radagon, the cosmic being known as the Elden Beast, which, if we rewind, was the literal embodiment of order and thus the Elden Ring, just kind of slithers out of the void, and you know the drill. Once you kill the Elden Beast, you're presented with some different endings, depending on a variety of choices you made along the way. I assume there is no ending relating to the Erdtree DLC, but let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. Starting with the shittiest ending of them all, the Frenzied Flame ending. If you decide to get fingered by this weird three-fingered entity, you become a carrier of the Frenzied Flame, and Melina doesn't have to die when burning the Erdtree with the flame from the Giant's Forge. This Frenzied Flame thing, once you get your hands on the Elden Ring, means you just, like, burn everything. Like, you just kill everyone. It's all going, it's gone. Except Melina's still alive, and she's gonna hunt you down for all of eternity. And now do you see why the whole Glowmite Queen theory is very plausible? The next worst ending is the Age of Order, which is where you just kind of restore what the Golden Order was doing. And if you choose that one, that's kind of boring. The next ending you could choose is the Age of Despair, which requires going through a whole quest line with this guy named the Dung Eater, who just, like, okay, I don't think he actually eats dung. He just wants to spread a really bad virus around and make everyone have, like, warts and suffer and stuff. I get why would you do this? The default ending, on the other hand, while not being horrible, isn't particularly satisfying to me. America is still a god, presumably, so you're her Elden Lord, but is she really, like, anything, like, alive anymore? This just kind of sounds like a depressing ending. The second best ending I would suggest is the Age of the Duskborn, where you essentially just bring back and repair death into the Elden Ring configuration, which apparently wasn't already sorted out before, but otherwise nothing else about the Order seems to really be changed. So it's kind of just, eh. The last ending of these 6, and easily the best in my opinion, is the Age of Stars. This one, which you can only get by completing Ranni's quest, allows you to, number 1, no longer be maidenless, an absolute win in my books, and number 2, remove gods and all this crazy shit from the lands between, allowing people to rely on the stars for guidance, whatever that totally entails. Kind of just seems like she wants to not with people and leave them be, and I'm all for that. While Elden Ring is possibly the most lore-dense video game I will probably ever cover in my lifetime, a lot of that is due to the sheer scope of everything. So many characters, so many of them being gods or demigods, so many places, so many species. It's just a lot of stuff to cover, and I'm almost certain there's going to be even more exposition that is clarified about base game Elden Ring lore and primarily Shadow of the Erdtree lore moving forward past this video. But what do you guys think? Is the lore way too vague still, and did the DLC also just give you even more questions about Elden Ring's story than you had before? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please do subscribe for more like it in the future. And as always, I'll talk to you next time. Bye everyone.